Have you ever finished a story and felt like something was missing, even if the plot was technically solid? A lot of the time, what's missing isn't action or twists, it's change. Because at the core of almost every powerful story is a character arc. Something shifts, something evolves, someone changes. By the end of the story, a character is different from who they were at the beginning, or at least they should be. In this video, we'll talk about character arc and how it works beneath the surface. So let's begin by defining what a character arc actually is. At its simplest, it's internal change over time. Not just things happening to a character, but something shifting inside them in response to those events. That shift is usually tied to a belief. To clarify, at the start of a story, most characters hold some kind of flawed or incomplete belief about themselves, other people, or the world in which they reside. Usually, that belief comes from their past. Maybe they were hurt, maybe they failed, maybe they learned the wrong lesson from something painful. So they build an internal rule. It might be something like, I can't rely on anyone but myself. Love makes you vulnerable. If I lose control, everything falls apart. Trusting people only leads to pain. My worth depends on success. Whatever their belief, it shapes how they move through the world. It affects their choices, their relationships, their reactions, everything. But over the course of the story, this belief gets challenged. That is the arc. It's not just growth. It's the process of confronting, testing, and either changing or reinforcing that belief. So when people say a character developed, what they usually mean is that their internal perspective evolved in a meaningful way. Let's talk about a positive arc, since this is the one most people are aiming for. This is where a character begins with a flawed belief and gradually moves toward a healthier, more truthful one. At the beginning, they're limited by the belief. It shapes their decisions, creates conflict, and often causes harm either to themselves or to others. As the story progresses, they're put in situations that challenge that belief, not just once, but repeatedly. And here's the important part. They don't change immediately. They resist. They fall back into old patterns. They make mistakes. Sometimes they double down on the very thing that's holding them back. But eventually, something shifts. They recognize the flaw in their thinking, and they choose to act differently. That choice is the turning point. A great example of this kind of arc is Tony Stark. At the beginning of his journey, he's driven by ego, control, and a belief that he can fix everything through his own intelligence and power. Over time, especially across multiple films, that belief gets challenged again and again. He faces the consequences of his actions, the limits of his control, and the cost of his choices. And by the end, he's someone who understands sacrifice in a completely different way. The arc works because it's not instant. It's built through conflict, failure, and gradual realization. Looking at the House of Croft series, we can see this kind of progression in the way one of the main characters, named Samantha, navigates trust, identity, and control. At the beginning, there's a strong sense of self-reliance, a feeling that staying guarded is safer. That control equals survival, and that makes sense given the fact that she's a highly trained government agent tasked with a secret mission. But as the story unfolds, she's placed in situations where that belief starts to crack. She's forced into alliances, into uncertainty, into relationships that don't operate on her terms. And what's important here is that the shift doesn't happen all at once. There's resistance toward it. There are moments where she falls back into old patterns, where trusting someone feels like a mistake, or where Pulling away feels safer, but gradually, through conflict and consequence, something changes. She starts to see that her belief isn't entirely protecting her, it's isolating her. And the turning point comes when she chooses consciously to act differently. Not because it's easy, but because she's starting to believe something new. That's the core of a positive arc. Not perfection, not instant growth, but a shift in how the character sees the world and how they choose to act because of that. Now, let's flip that and look at the negative arc. This is where a character starts with a flawed belief, and instead of overcoming it, they fall deeper into it. It's where the character is given every opportunity to grow and doesn't. Instead, they double down on the very belief that's hurting them. Sometimes this can be even more compelling because we're watching someone fail to change. They're given opportunities to grow. They're confronted with the truth, but they reject it. They justify their actions. They rationalize their behavior. They choose the path that reinforces their worst instincts. Let me give you a quick example. Imagine a character, let's call him Daniel, who believes that power is the only thing that keeps people safe. Maybe he grew up in chaos. Maybe he saw what happens when people don't have control. So his belief becomes, if I'm not in control, everything falls apart. Now, throughout the story, he's given chances to trust others, to share responsibility, to let go even slightly, but every time something goes wrong, it reinforces his belief. So instead of changing, he tightens his grip. He becomes more controlling, more isolated, more willing to cross lines he wouldn't have crossed before. And by the end, he's not just someone who believes in control, he's someone consumed by it. Another more classic example of this is Walter White from Breaking Bad. At the start, his actions are framed as understandable, even sympathetic. He wants to protect his family and provide for them. However, underneath that is a deeper belief tied to pride, control, and identity. As the story progresses, he has multiple chances to step away, to change course, to acknowledge what he's becoming, but he doesn't. Instead, he leans further into that identity until it completely consumes him. What makes this type of arc work is that it's not random, it's consistent. Every step deeper into the character's belief feels like a choice, even if it's the wrong one. We can see the moments where things could have gone differently. Now, flat arcs are interesting because technically the character doesn't change, at least not in the same way. Instead, they start with a strong belief that's already true. And the story challenges that belief, not to break it, but to test it. So instead of the character changing, they change the world around them. Let's say, for example, you have a character who believes that people deserve a second chance. They hold onto that belief, even when it's difficult, even when it backfires. Other characters within the story might disagree with them, the world might push against it, but the character stays consistent, and over time, their belief starts to influence others. It creates change externally. A great example here is Captain America. From the beginning, he has a strong moral core. He believes in doing what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. The world around him changes. Circumstances become more complicated, but his core belief stays consistent. What changes is how that belief impacts others and how it reshapes the environment around him. Flat arcs often show up in stories with strong thematic messages where the character serves as a kind of anchor. Now, this kind of arc can show up in less obvious ways, especially with supporting characters who act as emotional anchors. characters who don't necessarily shift dramatically themselves, but who affect the protagonist's journey. And that's an important reminder. Not every arc needs to be big or dramatic to be effective. So how do you take all of this and actually apply it? It really comes down to three things. First, figure out what your character believes at the beginning of the story, not just on the surface, but underneath. What are they operating on emotionally? Why do they believe this to be true? Second, design your story in a way that challenges that belief. And I don't just mean one big moment, I mean multiple situations that test it in different ways from different angles, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly. The story should consistently apply pressure to that belief. And third, decide on how the character responds over time. Do they change? Do they resist? Do they fail to change? That's your arc. It isn't just something that happens to a character. It's something they actively participate in. And one thing I want to stress here is the change should come from them. Not just from events happening around them, but from a decision that they make, because that's what makes it feel earned. A few quick things to watch out for. 1, making the change too sudden. If your character flips from one belief to another without enough buildup, it doesn't feel real. Another is separating the arc from the plot. If the arc of your story doesn't actually challenge your character internally, the arc will feel disconnected, and probably the most important thing to avoid, namely, trying to force growth instead of letting it emerge from the conflict. The arc isn't something you add on. It's something that should naturally grow out of the story that you're telling. But sometimes writers focus so much on external events that they forget to show the internal shift at all. We see what happens, but not how it affects the character. That's where arcs tend to fall flat. And personally, this was probably the part I struggled with most when I first started writing. I was so focused on plot, I forgot to make my characters change over the course of the story. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, at the end of the day, character arcs aren't just about change. They're about who a character is at the beginning, what challenges that identity, and who they become by the end. They're about tension between what a character believes and what the story forces them to confront. That's where the emotion comes from. That's what makes a story feel meaningful. Because when a character changes or refuses to, it reflects something real, something human. And that is what people connect with. For although plot might get people interested, character is what makes them stay. If this helped clarify character arcs for you, feel free to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're working on your own story, I'd love to know, what belief does your main character start with? Drop it in the comments. I'm really curious to hear about your project. And if you want more breakdowns like this, please subscribe for more writing content. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.